Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Bayonetta 2 walkthrough. It's time for even more Tag Climax! Don't worry though, we are beginning to near the end. We have just got this particular part which will be covering the last row of verses. And then the next part, I believe, is 2 of the optional characters, and then the final part will be the other optional character. I'm not playing as Jeanne because, well, she's going to have an entire part to herself, and while the same could be said of the other optional character that we'll be getting to play as, there's a little bit more to talk about in terms of Tag Climax, and also I had an achievement which I was never expecting, so it had to be shown off and will be discussed in full. Now, you may be looking at this entire part and thinking, good grief, it's 30 minutes of this. And yes, it is 30 minutes of this. But don't worry, this is, I think, 3 rounds of Tag Climax, and it is the point where I started to have to replay verses. So I think you'll probably see Worship appear twice throughout this thing, because that is the one that nets you the most halos, and that's the most useful one to me. Now, about that rant that I said I was going to go on. Well, to unlock the super secret optional ridiculously difficult boss in Bayonetta 2, you need to get what I think it's 9,999,999 halos. Now you may think, oh, that's fine, surely that's easily collectible in the game somehow, and you'll just kind of naturally build up about that amount. Well, while it may technically be the case, potentially roughly, if you want to get the accessories, which are incredibly expensive, and all the costumes, which are also ridiculously expensive, and all the extra weapons and all the techniques, by the time that you have beaten the game on second climax, third climax, first climax, infinite climax, you've bought everything, once you've played through as many rounds of Tag Climax as I will have done by the end of this particular set of the extras, guess what? You're not gonna have 9,999,999 halos. And oh my god. Now, while you can collect halos at a ridiculously fast rate in Tag Climax, particularly by playing the Worship verse, but also, I mean, potentially the Eustisha verse and the Sapientia verse, which hasn't shown up as being unlocked here, but that's because I recorded this particular video before I took on Witch Trial 4. And it will be shown towards the end of this stretch of videos. So, while you can get a lot of halos from them, problem comes in that even then, you're still only getting perhaps 300,000, 400,000 halos per round of Tag Climax. And while I mean that's a lot of halos, that still means that potentially you've got to play through hours of Tag Climax in order to get enough halos to unlock that super secret hard final boss. I mean, so I was recording footage the other night, and it took me what was essentially an hour to collect 3 million halos. So, in order, and that's me playing semi-reasonably well. So that's kind of at least 3 and a bit hours worth of straight Tag Climax play to get enough halos for that boss. And that is if you are particularly competent at the worship verse. If you struggle with that, then it's potentially going to take you even longer. I mean, I would suspect that if you aren't competent at the worship verse, or competent at Bayonetta in general, then you're not even going to want to go anywhere near trying to beat the ultra secret difficult extra boss. Because, I mean, you would not stand a chance, you'd get eaten for breakfast. But it's just, once you've played through every single one of the verse cards, it just gets a little bit dull and tedious. Like, playing Bayonetta is a lot of fun, and it will remain so. And it's always a fun, excellent challenge. But trying to complete kind of 3 hours straight of just pure battling with, after a certain point, potentially very little variation. Because, I mean, when I was recording last night, it was every single round started with worship, because that's the quickest way of getting halos, so if I died at any point, then I still got those halos. So did that verse. I mean, I did try and shake it up a little bit, but it was still going for the slightly easier verses just to make sure things got completed, or going for Sapientia and Eostitia, and just repeating those same verses again and again and again and again. For the space of an hour is what I played. It was just, it does get a little bit tedious, and I just wish that they had perhaps lowered the total needed to get the platinum ticket. Because it certainly was not that big during Bayonetta 1. If I recall correctly, it was only like 999,999. I mean, it might have been slightly more, maybe. But the Halo farming method that was available in the form of Gaze of Despairing Temperantia made things a lot less tedious. I mean, it was still slightly tedious because you had to do that boss fight again and again and again and again. But I don't think it took me hours and hours to get the halos required to take it on. Which it just sort of, it's a bit of a pain, really. And I don't think that necessarily it's worth that many halos.
You've got the right eye for talent.
But actually, no, it does need to be the exact same cost, but I'm pretty sure that unlocking stuff is just a little bit more difficult here. And I think it is because of the lack of the Temperancia Halo farming technique. Because I can't quite remember how many Halos it gave you, but I'm pretty sure it was ridiculously large. I mean, he's terrible enemy to try and do that on now. Yeah, so you can get like almost 900,000 Halos plus if you kind of did ridiculously well in the original Bayonetta. Just by facing Temperancia alone, and that was a 6-minute fight. So that really wasn't that bad, whereas here it just apparently you can do something quicker, which I probably should have done. Which, because apparently there's someone who says that you can get 3 million Halos in 6 minutes, which would be wonderful. With basically using Bracelet of Time, Gaze of Despair, playing Chapter 14, ensuring your magic bar is full, activating Bracelet of Time before attacking, only using the punch combo, and dodging frequently. And that probably is an excellent method. As is, I mean, the tag climax, but to be honest, I think, in general, they actually do expect you to use tag climax for this, which is just not, it's not fun. I have to say, my entire rant has kind of just been completely disabled by the appearance of a single video, which is just slightly embarrassing. But it happens, I guess. It's certainly something that I'm going to be trying to do, because that'll save me time rather than spending another hour trying to bloody do tag climax. See, that's something that's always really cool with Bayonetta 2 and Bayonetta series in general, and pretty much most of Platinum Games' games, is that there's always something new to learn. Because, I mean, I like, as I've always said, I am not one of the best players of Bayonetta out there. I'm also not one of the most knowledgeable players of Bayonetta out there. There are people who are far more talented than I am. As proven by the fact that they put out all these incredibly well done videos, and I'm putting out these. But yeah, you can always learn something from kind of gameplay stuff, and as I hope I have generally been proving, there's also a lot of kind of intellectually stuff that you can think about and learn. It's like the stuff to do with orthodox Christian views of Halos and the hierarchy of angels, and I don't know whether I've gone into stuff to do with narrative and the whole stable time paradox, and the fact that kind of both Bayonetta 1 and Bayonetta 2 work on that same principle of a stable time paradox, where the events of the game take place, but they also kind of necessitate the creation of the start of the game. But there was a point before that. So, for example, in the original Bayonetta, Boulder takes baby Cereza out of the past in order to get her to see present-day Bayonetta, in order for baby Cereza to become present-day Bayonetta. So, right there's a time paradox, but because he creates that, the whole thing kind of creates a never-ending circle where everything kind of has to happen. And Bayonetta 2 follows that through with Boulder taking in Aesir's soul and then going back into the past and killing off all the witches and becoming the absolute arsehole Boulder that we knew from the first game. So there was kind of all that stuff going on, and it's a stable time loop and time paradox. I think stable time loop is probably a slightly more accurate terminology for it, but you catch my drift. So there's that, and then there's all the stuff about kind of game design and in general, like, these are very, very in-depth titles, even if they may seem slightly shallow on the surface, because, I mean, a lot of people do just kind of, particularly with the story of Bayonetta, they're just like, oh, it's completely ridiculous tosh. And while it is a bunch of kind of cliches, they're very, very interestingly employed. And, in fact, this is the level of geekage that I go to. In one of my dissertations for my university degree, I actually talk about Bayonetta and Bayonetta 2 and how they use intertextuality, if I can finally blurb that out. Because sort of, this is going to be a rather fun 10 minutes. I'm going to talk to you about my dissertation. It's a little bit of a sidetrack, but it will all make sense. So, and it's also kind of like a massive anecdote, but I hope it'll give you a little bit of insight into the way my mind works. So obviously for the longest time I've been a fan of video games and films, and particular brands, so like I've become a huge fan of Hideki Kamiya's work. Like, all of his games are wonderful. Maybe kind of slightly flawed in certain concepts, but generally their style is phenomenal. And kind of, I'm also a massive fan of Edgar Wright's films, like the Cornetto trilogy is phenomenal, and I love Scott Pilgrim. And when I began my degree, one of the first things that we got treated to was medieval literature, as anybody who's watched my playthroughs from around 2012, 2013 will remember. And so I fell in love with medieval literature, particularly the romances, and then I kind of came to be reading the works of Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote a bunch of romances, Eric and Enid, Yvain, Clige, Lancelot, and Percival. They've got other names, but that's generally how they're known. And for the longest time I was just like, what has drawn me to fall absolutely in love with this? because medieval romance and contemporary film and video games don't really seem to go together. And it was through kind of the fact that I like intertextuality, which comes from an idea of postmodernism, at least the term does, which is referencing other texts, essentially. So, when Bayonetta, earlier on in this very game, stated, "I'm just a lost little girl in Wonderland, suffering at the hands of the Queen's trumped-up troops, and off with their heads, eh?" And also "So you're saying diplomacy has failed, then?" Those are intertextual references and allusions to other titles. So it's kind of bringing the two together, so the other text and this text. So you've got bits of Alice in Wonderland and the Wonderful 101 and stuff kind of seamed into the game. And when I was kind of having to come up with an idea for a dissertation topic, that was something that came up, and I was just like, I think that actually works. I think that actually might explain why I have fallen so in love with this particular medieval literature. It's because it's this same brand of referencing and alluding to the sort of a fun game that creates a very specific style that both is irreverent but also highly reverential, which is a bit of a paradox. But it's that it strives to create something new and fun and interesting, but it also makes use of older stuff and plays with it and gets you to think about the text that you're dealing with in new and interesting ways. And while you can say that kind of plot-wise and character-wise and so on, Bayonetta and stuff is very simple, intertextually it's very complex. And it gets even more complex when you start throwing in the whole issue of interactivity, which is essentially where my dissertation kind of starts to come to a conclusion. So, Bayonetta's narratives and its story is actually a lot more interesting than a lot of people give it credit for. I mean, maybe I'm giving Hideki Kamiya too much credit, but I'm pretty sure I'm not wrong. Because it takes a certain type of person to be able to play the games that are played in Bayonetta, with its references and the way the style is. And not many developers and writers do that. And kind of the prime kind of companion that I could think of in film was Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, kind of by association, because they were all involved in the Cornetto trilogy. So, I mean, there are writers out there who do that sort of stuff, but it's a very, very rare thing, and I really like it when it happens. Like, the texts that can do that sort of stuff, kind of no matter the medium, just really excite me, and I think it's partly down to the fact that I just have really geekish pride and just love of seeing the stuff that I enjoy in so many different things. And I guess it's something that sort of video games have kind of groomed me to enjoy, but it's something that's very interesting, and I love it, and I'm so glad that I got to actually write a dissertation on it at my university, which, like, I was not expecting to be allowed to do, because there is a slight snobbery of texts at my uni. They prefer you to deal with, how shall we say, canonical texts. So they're quite happy with Milton and Shakespeare and Dickens, and I mean they do kind of allow kind of a much wider spread than that, but new mediums they get a little bit very hesitant on. So they prefer the tradition, which I mean makes sense considering where it is. Yeah, so I'm over the moon that I've got to do that particular dissertation and include one of the games, well, two of the games that I love the most, and also mention other games that I also absolutely adore, because managed to get Okami in there, managed to get the one for 101 in there, and just, yes. Now, I'll point out, I was kind of just blabbing over that, but we actually ended up in another of those optional verses, which pitted us against Rosa and Boulder. Now, having completed that verse, if we get to the end of the tag climax round, then we rather brilliantly and wonderfully unlock Boulder as a playable character. Which is just like, yes! So happy! And the same occurs if you beat the optional verse that unlocks Rodan. So, it's verse card 53, and it is one of these kind of rotating random verse cards. I think the order is something like Rodan, Bayonetta and Jeanne, Rosa and Boulder. I think there may be one more in the kind of string, but they do kind of, they cycle. So if you've cocked up on one of them and failed, then you're going to have to go through the rest of the cycle before it will return to allowing you to play that particular verse. Which is a bit of a dickish way of going about it, but thankfully it is only like 16 or so verses, which means that that's like 2 and a bit rounds of tag climax, which if you play the very quick verses, it's about maybe half an hour to get it all done. Which is perhaps a bit too much gameplay for wanting to just unlock one verse, but ah well. And now we've just got one more swig at Worship. You'll be seeing a lot more of him in the final few parts of the tag climax stuff, but we're nearly done. Although one thing I will desperately point out, do not use Umbra and Climax whilst trying to do this verse. Unless you desperately just need to kill him off quickly, because it dramatically lowers your combo potential. Meaning that you kind of just will not get the requisite halos that you desire. But there we go. It's another round of tag climax complete. And we've unlocked Boulder. And I believe that in the next part, we will actually start to get to play as bowler. Think I'm right in that. We'll see. It's certainly happening soon, I can tell you that much.